So dear beloved community, it's such a joy to be together with everybody. I hope that you're all well in body and mind, wherever you might be, a little bit all over the world. Today is the 13th of September in the year 2020, and we're sitting together with the Sangha that's present everywhere. Thank you so much for being here. The other day, I was discussing with a venerable monk that is living not too far away. He's originally from Sri Lanka. And we were discussing about this pervasive sense of not being good enough that many of us that are raised in modern societies have, and how we bring this tendency of feeling that we're not good enough to our practice. And I was talking with him about the practice that I recommended to everybody a number of months ago, which was a practice that the Buddha recommended in the texts after the recollections of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and our generosity to recollect our own good qualities. And the venerable monk from Sri Lanka was saying that it is quite funny that I was talking about that, because he had recommended this practice also to his students, but he was doing it slightly differently. He was asking them to have a little exercise book in which whenever they did something kind, they opened their heart to another person, they said a kind word, they chose not to shut down, or they offered a meal or whatever it might be, some kind action, that they would write it down in that book, and they would keep it in a place. And whenever they were going through a difficult moment, they would open that book and they would read all of these wonderful things that they have done. And I think that's a wonderful practice to do. I would like to recommend that each of us has a little exercise book or a file on our computer that we call I'm Really Not So Bad. And whenever we are having a very difficult moment, we think that we're the worst in the world, or so on, that we open that file and we read it, or maybe we sing the things that we've done, or the qualities that we see in ourselves, or we recite them. This is a powerful practice of recognizing our own innate goodness, which in Buddhism is the foundation from which all the good qualities flow. The fact that we have this innate seed of goodness that we're practicing to uncover and allow to flow forth. So I recommend it as a concrete practice to note down the ways in which you've been a support for others, or the kind things that you've done very concretely. And then over time, you'll fill up a digital file, or you'll fill up an exercise book with those qualities, and it'll be such a support, such a wonderful thing to read. And then it becomes very difficult to doubt the fact that you have this wonderful seed of goodness. I'd like to recommend it to everybody. Over the past 2.5 months, while we've been considering the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, we've been focused on delving deeply into each one of these aspects, the aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. And I realized that it might be a nice idea to have a look at why we use the word noble to describe the 8 aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. The word noble, even though I haven't really mentioned it up to now, is actually quite key. And it helps us to understand the reason for some of the emphases in the Buddha's teaching. The word noble is used by the Buddha to describe a particular type of practitioner. The type of person, the type of practitioner, which is the whole purpose of his teaching in order to be able to generate. A noble person, a noble person in Buddhism is not considered noble because of their birth or their status or how many possessions they have and so on, but rather it's someone who realizes the truth of the Four Noble Truths for themselves in the heart of their own lives as an insight, not as an intellectual exercise. It's only when we realize that, even to a small extent, that we can be called noble, when we've grasped the reality, not the theory, but we actually see the operation of the Four Noble Truths for ourselves in our lives. If we want to understand the ways in which the Noble Truths nurture this sense of nobility in us, then it might be helpful to reflect on the four concrete tasks or practices that the Four Noble Truths invite us to put into practice. The first Noble Truth, which is the truth of suffering, of dukkha, is to be fully understood. The task or the practice that it offers us is of full understanding, of seeing our situation clearly. A hallmark of a real practitioner, a person that's truly devoted to their transformation, is that we don't allow ourselves to be swept away, but we practice to look at and to understand the nature of things, suffering, happiness, and so on from within. The second noble truth of the origin or cause of dukkha, of suffering or unsatisfactoriness, invites us to concretely practice letting go, of leaving behind. A noble practitioner is one who practices to recognize and not be dazzled by the three strands of thirst, of craving, or tanha, as we spoke about last week, and is practicing to the best of their capacity to be able to let go rather than to hold on, to leave behind. There was an interesting question that was raised in the Facebook group over the past week. So what's the cause of craving? The Buddha, very briefly, the Buddha shares with us that the first cause of craving, the first cause of this round is ignorance. And so as meditation practitioners, we're devoted to transforming this deep root of ignorance, of not seeing clearly. The third noble truth, which is the reality of well-being, the reality of happiness, the fact that there is an end to unsatisfactoriness or suffering, invites us into waking up and realizing what needs to be done by us. Of course, by others. And again, we're pretty good at that. We know what needs to be done by everybody else. This is not the main focus of the third noble truth. The main focus of the third noble truth is what needs to be done by each one of us. This is a realization, not a to-do list. Once we understand deeply or even superficially the inner or outer nature of this round of samsara, that it's not something that happens to us, but something that we're constantly, actively, and honestly quite diligently co-creating, then our orientation begins to change. It begins to shift away from what Tay described to me as small comforts to the big comfort. There's this deep sense of, oh, this again. And then finally, the fourth noble truth, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. And it invites us into applying these insights and concretely developing them in 8 areas of our life. Why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? there's a sutra called the Rohitasa Sutra. And in that sutra, the Buddha says that it's within this fathom-long body with its perception and its intellect that I declare that there is the world, there's the origination of the world, there's the cessation of the world, and the path of practice leading to cessation. If we look at this sentence, if we take a moment to analyze it, and those of you who have had a chance to practice in the sutra class together with us, you know that I love to analyze the texts a little bit. You'll notice that this sentence is almost identical to sentences elsewhere in the canon, which are describing the Four Noble Truths, except here the word world, loka, is used instead of suffering. All the Four Noble Truths are found within ourselves, within you. I've said before, and I said it at the beginning of this talk, that I really do believe that one of the biggest issues that we have as practitioners is this pervasive sense of lack. The feeling that we don't have the capacity to transform our situation, or that we don't have the capacity to understand, to go deeply, to be able to liberate ourselves, or to think that we need something from somebody else. The Four Noble Truths are to be discovered by each one of us for ourselves, within ourselves. So please, if you care for yourself, if you love Thay, then today, not tomorrow, not next week, today, right now, in fact, spend some time and acknowledge to yourself that you can do it. You have the capacity to do it. Take ownership and stop running. We need to stop thinking that the truth is out there, or that ultimate causes and so on are out there somewhere else. The truth is out there might be a catchy phrase from the TV series The X-Files. Was really popular in the 90s. There were even people had t-shirts that said the truth is out there. But the Buddhist equivalent would be to say the truth is right in here. The truth is in you already. Now, as practitioners, we need to get to work and to discover this truth for ourselves. This is not hard labor. It's a delight, and it's the work, the real work of each and every moment. We tend to be caught in pairs of opposites, things such as suffering and happiness, liberation, samsara, this idea of this and that. These we call conventional designations, and we know that conventional designations can never describe ultimate reality because they're always based on concepts, and concepts can't ever accurately or even closely describe reality. We can look at the third noble truth as the reality that well-being is possible. Also, it can be seen as liberation is possible, or nirvana. Nirvana is beyond all terms of duality and relativity. In fact, it's said in the text that here the four elements of solidity, fluidity, heat, and motion have no place. The notions of length and breadth, the subtle and the gross, name and form are altogether destroyed. Neither this world nor the other, nor coming, going, or standing, neither birth nor death, nor sense objects are to be found. And then in the text it said, and what is the noble method that's rightly seen and discovered by discernment? This is the case where a disciple of the noble ones notices when this is, that is. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. When this isn't, that isn't. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. And we've explored together deeply the reality that nothing can exist by itself alone. Everything is constantly in a state of co-arising, both within and around. So the third noble truth, realizing well-being, which is called in Pali Niroda, or cessation, release, emerges directly from the second noble truth, which we explored together last week. The realization that the transformation of suffering, the transformation of this unsatisfactoriness, this dukkha, comes with letting go of clinging, of holding on and identifying in its three forms. Hopefully this past week, you've had some time to explore clinging and letting go on the macro level with situations outside, and on the micro level with situations inside. And each week we've been looking at the three turnings of the wheel with each of the noble truths. So the three turnings of the wheel with regard to this third noble truth this evening are the first turning of the wheel, which is recognition within oneself, the recognition that well-being is possible. We've seen a situation of suffering, of unsatisfactoriness or dukkha within our experience. We've practiced to understand that there's a cause, and we've identified that there's a cause, a concrete cause in our life. And then now there's the recognition coming from within us that it's possible to transform this situation, that well-being is possible. If this is, then that is. It's possible to transform this situation. That's the first turning of the wheel. The second turning of the wheel is that well-being should be obtained. I want to be happy, in simple words. I would like to be happy. I would like to transform this suffering. And then the third turning of the wheel is the realization. When it comes to its full fruition through one cycle, that well-being has been obtained, that this aspect of suffering, this situation has been transformed. As we've spoken of before, when we bring mindful attention to our experience, we notice that there's always a feeling tone that is almost automatically associated with an experience, a tone of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That tone, called feeling in the Pali Canon, which is distinct from emotions, usually triggers tandha, craving or thirst, in one of its three strands, which tends to give rise to clinging, which, as we explored last week, co-arises together with this sense of unsatisfactoriness, this sense of dukkha. And as we become more sensitive and aware and develop the capacity of bare awareness, rather than getting caught up in story and interpretation, we simply note the feeling tone, and we begin to notice our automatic responses, which interrupts this pattern of suffering, this pattern of samsara. We're not trying to change the feeling tone itself, but we are trying not to react to it through one form of clinging or another. Let's have a sound of the bell. Our habit of clinging, our habit of grasping on desperately to ideas or people or situations or position in order to give us any form of security. It's so deeply ingrained in us that we consider it to be natural. And it's quite a challenge to make the other choice, to make this radical choice to let go. I'm reminded whenever I think of this challenge that how unnatural this process in the beginning of letting go can feel. I'm reminded of my Chinese doctor. She's an amazing Korean doctor. And she always says, small pain will cure big pain. She always says that before she puts the big needles in. But small pain is going to cure big pain. And it's definitely true in terms of the spiritual life. It can be not necessarily painful, but somewhat uncomfortable in the beginning stages to make that different choice. But after a while, we discover that everything seems to be upside down. The things that we used to consider to be happiness are not happiness at all. The things that we considered to be blissful or freeing are not those things at all. That in fact, by making the choice to let go, of making the choice to go a little bit more deeply, that we begin to see things in a completely different way. Let me just say honestly that without the insight of the third noble truth, there'd be no Buddhism or no point to practice. If the Buddha had only realized the first two noble truths, that there's suffering and that suffering has a cause, that would be a bit depressing, wouldn't it? It'd be a bit like those t-shirts from the 90s that read life suffering and then you die, except they didn't really say suffering. They used another word to describe life. Everyone remembers what was written, at least those of us that were around in the 90s remember what was written, but the sense is the same. People who have the idea that Buddhism is about being bummed out all the time haven't yet moved on from the first noble truth. The third noble truth is the insight that it is possible for each of us to transform our situation, to transform our individual and collective pain into wisdom and insight. Remember that with the insight of Buddhism, the insight of non-duality, the idea that wisdom and insight is somehow completely separated from our everyday humdrum existence is a completely mistaken view. This is what the Buddha discovered, that there is an end to suffering, to this unsatisfactoriness, and that anybody, anywhere, here and now, you can experience the end of suffering, which is well-being. I actually find it a bit strange, but of the Four Noble Truths, this third noble truth, the ending of suffering, is the one that's spoken about the least. It's often glossed over, actually, except by Tay, who really emphasized well-being. The main reason that many teachers give for focusing on the first, the second, and the fourth noble truths is, of course, that everything contains everything else, but that the third noble truth, well-being, is the result of applying the practices correctly. It's the result that we can expect if we apply the Noble Eightfold Path and the insight of the other noble truths correctly. When we practice, well-being becomes possible, and not only possible, but experienced. And also, there's the thinking that by focusing on root causes, the root causes of situations, that the results will show themselves fully to the practitioner, to each of us. So most of the emphasis is on the path of practice rather than on the results, on the process, which in the spiritual world is seen as the destination in itself. The third noble truth is basically the natural response of any intelligent person if we wake up to the reality of the second noble truth. If we see the causes of our suffering, our thirst, our craving arising from this mistaken sense of lack, which has its root of ignorance, delusion, which, as I shared earlier, is seen to be the first cause. Then within the second noble truth, we practice to abandon it. Or as some of my young friends would say, just walk away. We walk away from thirst for sensory input, thirst for becoming, or the thirst to get rid of something. The third noble truth is just that. It's the act of really abandoning, really letting go these forms of thirst, these forms of craving once and for all, and recognizing that you're doing it. Recognizing that you're doing it. Fellow list lovers, take heart. In the Pali version of the truth, there are 6 different forms of letting go or abandoning that are mentioned. Initially, the 6 forms of abandoning look very similar. The Buddha had a tendency sometimes to do this, but that's the mark of an incredibly skillful teacher, to make sure that if you don't get it on the first round, you'll get it one way or another. The 6 steps of abandoning are, well, first of all, viraga, which is dispassion. The texts talk about 2 different ways to develop dispassion for craving or thirst, this sense of disinterestedness in craving or thirst. One way is to simply turn to look at the craving rather than to just mindlessly react from it. To turn around and to look it in the face, to call it by its true name, maybe to smile to it. And then we often notice that this passion for whatever object is calling our giving rise to this craving or thirst tends to diminish. The other way is to apply the 4 right efforts. When we notice that there's one of those 3 strands of thirst arising, to give rise to the practice of the 4 right efforts. Actually, what the Buddha would say is that while, of course, we have all of these different passions, these different cravings, what we're actually passionate about, what we're actually passionate for, is our craving. We identify with it on a very deep level. Sure, we crave things, but we like our craving even more than we like things or objects. We might crave sensory input, for example, but what we really feed off is the thirst for that. And so first we have to learn how to not keep feeding it. And most importantly, not to feed off it. I've spoken in the past about disenchantment. Viraga or dispassion, which is one of the 6 forms of abandoning or letting go, comes right after disenchantment. And I've always loved to see disenchantment as that moment when you wake up and it's like the scales have fallen from your eyes and everything, the magical situation that was going on, the illusory situation, you see it for what it is. And then, so right after that, there's this sense of being sick and tired of feeding off the issues that our own mind produces. We become tired or bored with living in our own constant soap opera, our own constant drama, the drama that we create within And if we have drama within, we create drama around. And this is drama with a capital D. I think I mentioned it, that Dharma with a capital D would be a good title for a book. Well, this is drama for with a capital D. This quality of disenchantment is a beautiful quality that arises when we begin to see that the things, whether they're objects, ideas, or so on, that we've been feeding on, don't really satisfy us that much, just for maybe a short period of time, but then we're right back where we started again. The second of these aspects of abandoning or letting go is Niroda, cessation. When we don't have so much passion for these things, these dramas and so forth, we stop producing them. We're not giving them fuel. We discover what their fuel is and we cut off the source of nutriment to them, and they sputter to a stop eventually. Might take a couple of seconds, it might take a couple of weeks, might take a year. Because there might be a little residual fuel still in the pipes. But eventually they sputter to a stop. And this is what's called cessation. The next two qualities actually go together. It's tago, which is giving back, and patinisago, which is relinquishing. These qualities are realizing that we've been holding on to things that weren't ever really ours to begin with. And so we offer them back. This energetic offering them back. We offer them back with an open hand, like a return to sender. There's that old saying, you'll have to pry this so-and-so from my cold, dead hands. Well, these qualities are not that. They're probably the exact opposite of that. This is a moment of realizing that you no longer want this. You no longer need this. It's not serving anymore. And so this relinquishing, returning to sender, putting it down, leaving it be is a beautiful thing. And then mutti is the next quality, which is you release it. You release. This is one of the most interesting aspects of abandoning, or at least it is for me. So far, actually, we've been hanging on to our craving. We've been milking it for everything we think we can get. With mukti, we let it go. We give it its freedom. And when we give it its freedom, when we just release this struggle, we release the craving, we let it go. It's then that we're free. There's no more struggle. We're no longer burdened with fighting against it or looking after it. It's just this, at that moment, that stage of abandoning, it's just this releasing it, completely letting it go, no more struggle. And then the last one is analaya, in which, in one sense, it means that we don't have any more nostalgia for our craving, for our thirst, the things that we used to identify with. There's not this sense of nostalgia. We've let it go. We know that we've let it go. And you know what? Actually, we don't miss it. Sometimes when we let go of an object of craving, an object that we identified with, an object of our thirst, we really miss it. And we're quite ready to pick it up the next time around. We still feel some nostalgia. We're ready to pick up that thing again the moment it crosses our path. With this aspect of letting go, with this aspect of abandoning, there's no more nostalgia. We've moved on once and for all. It's done. Let's have a sound of the bell. So Niroda Cessation or well-being in terms of the third noble truth is also described as nirvana or liberation. A few years ago, our teacher was giving a public talk in San Francisco, and I was backstage. I was sitting in his room as he was preparing for the talk. And as we were there, at one stage in the afternoon, he was doing some calligraphies, and he said, "Brother Fahai, come over here." And I came over next to Taya, and he said, "Look at this calligraphy." And Tay had written, "Nirvana is cool." And so I just joked with Tay and I said, Nirvana is cool, but Tay is also cool. Nirvana is cool. Nirvana means cooling down the flames, cooling down this continual burning, this world of heat. A couple of weeks ago, we had a young friend staying with us. Many times a day, that young friend would say, "Cool, cool, cool." And it actually became our weekly practice focus here in Mountain Spring. We'll often have a focus for our week. Cool, cool, cool was what we practiced here in Mountain Spring. Cool, cool, cool in each moment is nirvana. Although we don't want to get caught in concepts, and we definitely don't want to create another t-shirt about this, perhaps we could describe nirvana as effortlessly cool. The Buddha said and demonstrated through his own life that nirvana can be achieved in our own lives while living. It's not a place to go to after death. It's not a destination. There are some very popular but inaccurately phrased expressions like the Buddha entered into nirvana or parinirvana after his death. And I feel that these have fed into some mistaken views about nirvana. The moment that we hear the phrase that the Buddha entered into nirvana or parinirvana, we think that nirvana is a destination. We think it's a state or it's a realm as we understand it conceptually. Nirvana is not the result of anything. If it was a result, then it would be an effect which is produced by a cause. In that case, it would be produced by something, and anything produced by something is conditioned. As in Buddhism, we understand that there's conditioned co-arising. Nirvana is unconditioned. It's not considered to be produced by anything. It's not a cause, and it's not an effect. It's beyond cause and effect. Truth or reality is not a result and not an effect. So this is the third noble truth, the truth of well-being, the truth that well-being is possible, that we can transform our situation. And the way to transform the situation is by putting into practice the fourth noble truth as it speaks to our situation. And the fourth noble truth is, of course, the Noble Eightfold Path, which we looked into in a lot of detail over the past 2 months. And so with this talk this evening, we're coming to a conclusion of our series on the Four Noble Truths, since the fourth noble truth was already spoken about. We're going to have a sound of the bell, and then I'm going to be sharing a little bit about what we're going to be doing on Sunday evenings over the next few weeks.